Hello, in this presentation we're going to be talking about the elasticity of supply. Elasticity of supply having to do with the relationship between the price and the quantity supplied. We know that as the price goes up, the quantity supplied will go up. What we're looking into is how much the quantity supplied will go up as price goes up. Remember that when we're talking about price going up, we're not talking about an individual firm per se increasing the price. We're talking about firms being basically price takers, meaning the market price goes up and therefore more firms are willing to enter the market at that higher price, presumably because there's revenue to be made. So we have two terms. We've got elastic and inelastic once again, but this time in terms of supply rather than demand. Elastic then means a price increases the quantity supplied a lot. So if there's a price increase, we're going to increase the quantity supplied a lot. Small pressure being price, large change in the quantity as would be represented in, say, like a rubber band. And if we were to graph that, then we would have more of a horizontal supply curve in this case. If we take a look at an example, we can draw some points on this. We're going to say at $5, we've got a quantity of 25. If we chose another point on the line, say $15, we can see that there's this big change in the quantity from 25 to 100. That means it's elastic. Why? Because we had this little change in price and we had this big change in quantity, that being an elastic good. If we take a look at an inelastic supply curve, we have this upward sloping supply curve. It's going to be more vertical of a supply curve, representing the fact that it is more inelastic. If we look at our analogy, we're going to say there's a little pressure on price and there's going to be a little pressure in terms of quantity. Quantity is going to change just a little bit from the pressure that has been put on. In terms of our demonstration for elasticity, we're talking about the pressure being price, the change in quantity. That means that inelastic is equal to price increases quantity supplied a little. So if we graph this out, we're going to say, all right, if we have this point here, we'll say $5. We've got a quantity, let's say 25. And then if we move up to $15, we can see that the quantity changes just a little bit in relation to the price change. And whenever you have a question about these things, you can kind of you can graph these things out and look at these relationships. Graph a couple points, even if you don't know the numbers in it, you can pick one point in price and then pick another point and look at the relative relationship in terms of the quantity. Why would this be the case? Why would we have these types of goods that would be more elastic and types of goods that would be more inelastic? Much of it has to do with the time frame it would take and the cost it would take in order to increase production. So if price went up, how difficult is it for a firm to turn around and increase production? How difficult, how costly would it be? That's really what's going to determine the elasticity and inelasticity. A couple examples of this. First, if it's elastic, we're going to say that the per unit costs are generally going to be lower. And if it's inelastic, the per unit costs are generally higher. So if we're making something like a rubber band, then if price goes up on rubber bands and we need to increase production, then that can happen relatively quickly because the per unit cost of a rubber band isn't that high. So we can probably increase the production of rubber bands fairly quickly if there was an increase in price out there. On the other hand, if we're talking about something larger like a car, if prices went up in terms of a car, it would take longer for us to put in those implementations. It'd take longer for us to make the change in order to increase the production of the car because the price per unit is higher. Next item would be the time horizon. So if it's elastic, meaning the change in quantity is great with a change in price, the time horizon is short, meaning something like coffee, presumably if the price goes up, we can make more coffee relatively quickly. On the other hand, if we're talking about something like farmland, if we're talking about crop production, if the price goes up for a particular crop, say corn or something, then the farmer can't really change the crop too easily in terms of the time horizon. They might be able to get more out of the current crop than they had originally planned by being more efficient in terms of picking the crops, but they can't do too much as opposed to a longer time horizon, in which case they would be able to possibly plant different crops and respond to price changes in that way. Next factor affecting elasticity will be if it's elastic, we're going to have a small share of the input market versus inelastic, a large share of the input market. What that means, if we're talking about something like paper clips, if the price of paper clips goes up and we need to produce more of them, the steel that it takes to put into the paperclip is relatively small compared to the entire steel market. Therefore, when we start to increase the production of paperclips, probably not going to increase the price of steel. The input price is probably not going to be impacted. On the other hand, if we made something like cars and the price of cars went up and we wanted to make more cars, well, then the input factors into the car, including steel and other types of input factors, may go up as we purchase more, we make more cars, and that could, of course, make the product more inelastic in that case. Next factor for elasticity, we're going to have the narrow scope being more elastic and a wider scope of the market being more inelastic. For example, if we're talking about some kind of tablets that we have in a particular market and the price goes up in a particular market, and we need to increase the supply in that particular market, that will be easier to do if it's a regional type of area. We might be able to move supply from another area to that area and make the change relatively quickly. However, if we're talking about the entire market, if we're talking about like the world market, then it might be more difficult to increase the supply on that type of scales because of the resources that would be involved, and we'd have to increase the capacity of our production process. That, of course, would take more time. So if we're talking about a small market, we can probably make the changes to accommodate the change within the small market. But if we're talking about a very large market, we'd probably have to make more changes that would take a longer time in order to accommodate that. We, of course, can calculate the elasticity of supply as well. The elasticity of supply being similar to the elasticity of demand. That is the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. If we put this into the midpoint formula, the midpoint formula would be the change in quantity over the average quantity. And that's kind of the confusing little twist we put on this. Remember that when we're talking about a percentage change from period to period, if we're trying to see how good we did this year compared to last year, we would talk about the percentage increase being the difference divided by the original number. But we're trying to even this thing out. So instead of dividing by the original, we're taking the two numbers, the original and where we're at now, dividing by 2. And that's going to be the difference with the midpoint formula. We're going to divide that entire thing divided by the change in price over the average price. That's going to be our midpoint formula. When we do those types of calculations, when we perform the calculation, if the elasticity of supply is greater than 1, we're going to say it's elastic. If we say it's going to be elasticity of supply formula comes out to a number that is less than 1 point something, we're going to say it's inelastic. And if elasticity equals 1, then it would be unit elastic.